May we begin this morning with a word of prayer together. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and strengthening to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I had an experience yesterday that I had no intentions of it becoming part of the sermon, but life happens and you have experiences and they get filtered and added into what you want to say sometimes. So I had a first experience yesterday, my first time ever to harvest grapes, and had a chance to do that at Borgmont Winery, which is the winery we've used for our fundraiser event for the last several years. And I was able to do that with two other families in the church, and we went out and were able to do that together. Now, the invitation from the winery kept changing, and we were getting an email that the harvesting was going to happen on the 16th. And then we got an email that, no, the weather has changed and we're going to do it on the 23rd. And then we thought we're set for the 23rd. And then, no, the things have changed. The cooler temperatures came in. We're waiting until the 30th. So we kept having this ebb and flow when we're supposed to show up and do this harvesting experience. And just clear reminder that every time you want to act and do something, that there's sometimes external things that are outside your control you have to wait on before you can respond and act in the moment. So yesterday was the day we showed up and we got a little orientation. We were given two tools, some little kind of small little pruners, and a tool that looked like the forked tool you would use to pull up weeds, except it was used and had a kind of a razor blade in it. You would kind of push in to cut the grapevine to release the grapes. And so we got a little training on cutting the grapes and which ones to choose, which ones not to choose, which ones were not good. Don't take those and don't put those in the bin. And you put the grapes in the bin, and when it's full, staff would come by and pick up those bins. So I'm thinking, I'm gonna have a record. I'm gonna get the most grapes ever. So I'm going in there, I'm snipping left and right, cutting grapes and doing my job. And then out of nowhere, my left arm starts going crazy. This burning sensation hits. What I'd had when I reached in to cut some grapes, there was a big giant wasp nest in there I was not aware of. And so this wasp stings me on my wrist, and they're flying around my face. My arms are going everywhere. I'm in pain. I'm flailing around. I probably look like some ancient dance in there in the vineyards, trying to get these wasps off of me. And my glasses were flung about 10 feet. It was a crazy incident. And I looked down and I could see the spot where I'd been stung. So I kind of pinched to make sure I got the stinger out because it was not a good situation. The pain was bad. And luckily, one of the staff had an antiseptic wipe. And so I wiped that spot down quickly. They said, sometimes this is all you need. In about 30 minutes, that spot was red, big circle, puffy. It was not looking good. And so they went and got a Benadryl cream, and I wiped that on there, and luckily that kind of got me back in sync and feeling better. And I would say I tentatively went back into the vineyards to cut more grapes. So I clearly gently would pull something back to make sure there wasn't any other unusual creatures underneath the leaves. But it was kind of this reminder, sometimes when we want to go do something, we think we just go and do it. And we don't necessarily pay attention to the externals, whether it be weather or wasp nests or the things that we don't anticipate that get in the way of the things we think we're going to do good, and other externals maybe have a different pattern in mind before you can maybe feel like you're productive in whatever you're doing. Now, when Jesus is talking in chapter 15 of the Gospel of John, he is talking to disciples and probably others. It's often thought, most scholars think he's just talking to disciples. I think by chapter 15, Jesus had way more people of men and women around him listening to things he had to say. And he offers some wisdom to the people there in the moment. And he wants to offer this wisdom and say, I'm going to pass on some things I think will be really crucial. There will be a time when I'm not with you, but you're going to need this wisdom going forward. And his first crackerjack wisdom that we had never heard before is love one another. I mean, that's the one phrase Jesus says over and over and over again in the Gospels. Love one another just as I've loved you. It's some of the final words Jesus shares with the disciples in the upper room before his arrest. He says, "This final commandment I leave to you is love one another." And it seemed like that'd be simple enough. If everyone just loved one another, the world would be way better than what we are seeing and experiencing today. But he doesn't stop with just love one another, because the methods by which people love one another can be radically different. Some people do it in a gentle way, and some people maybe think they're being loving and they're actually being mean to other people and don't realize they're being mean because of their status or role or the color of their skin or whatever it might be that gets in the way of love being a true measure of love to one another. And then the second kind of wisdom he passes on in this reflection he offers to those that listen is, one was love one another. But I said, I want you to love one another with a new way of looking at one another. I no longer want you to look at one another in terms of your stage of life or your level of importance. I'd rather you just love one another as friends. Now, my grandmother, when she was educating pretty much herself in a lot of ways, never got past an 8th grade education. My grandmother, who reached that age, at least of education level of only 8th grade, she shouldn't be limited of who she loves based on someone that got a PhD in mathematics. Those two should be able to find equal status of sharing love together and making a difference in the world, regardless of stage of life or life experience for that person. And so he's saying friendship should override any kind of status we have. Anything we have on our resume, whatever life experience, job experience, wisdom, education, whatever it might be, those shouldn't get in the way of the nature of how we treat one another relationally with one another. And then the third thing he says in this passage is, I want you to not just know it's important to love one another, not just know it's important to treat each other as friends, as equals in an equitable way, but I want you actually to act out that love and friendship in the world and not just be something you know to do. I want it to be something you actually do live out every day. And his metaphor for that was bear fruit. I want you to go out and bear fruit. But he says it twice. The first time he says it, I want you to bear fruit. The second time he says it, bear fruit that lasts. Bear fruit that lasts. May your actions have some sustainable impact. May it not just be something you do in the moment, you feel good about yourself, you pat yourself on the back. I did something. I acted in love. I treated people as friends. But did it have some long-term sustainable impact by the things that you did? So one of the things I have valued in my time, 5.5 years of being in this congregation, is watching this congregation take on matters of justice and love in this bearing fruit that lasts kind of way. Now, I've told more than once that my arrival in May, my first day on the job was May 18th of 2020, right in the middle of COVID times. A week later, we're watching on TV, someone is using their phone, we watch the murder of George Floyd. Within hours of that video coming out, emails and calls were coming to me. Chris, what are we going to do about this racial injustice happening? There are people gathering down near the plaza. People are gathering. They're collecting supplies. The people are demonstrating. What will our response be? And my first gut reaction is I wanted to do something. And I think maybe sometimes it's a good thing to get emotional and to have certain things rise within you. I think that is a motivator for a lot of things, but we don't want emotion to be the only measure by which we respond to something. We respond by emotion in the moment. We think we're doing good, and maybe in the end, we're not doing good in the long run. And I wanted to do something like everybody else did. And I thought to myself, if we're going to step in to this racial justice work, I'm not going to step in, and then we're going to go back to life as normal a month later. If we're going to step into this racial justice work, we are in this for the long haul. We're in this because we're going to examine ourselves. We're going to examine the communities in which we live. We're going to find partners that are already doing racial justice work. It's not like we have the magic answers for solving all this. For centuries, people have been working on racial justice, and we simply would like to join the effort. And how do we do that? So we made a statement about racial justice for our church. We put a team together. We began partnering with individuals and organizations and finding ways to do that racial justice work. It's been 5.5 years, And there's still opportunities throughout the year for us to engage racial justice work in this church. And one of the great things about it is we've only scratched the surface of things, but we've made it more of a consistent identity of who we are, what we're about, how it reflects our theology, our values, how we care and treat one another as friends in the community in which we live. The other thing we learned in all that process was that racial justice isn't just about matters of race. Racial justice crosses over so many different other areas of justice. It's this intersectionality of justice. And so we enter into racial justice. We're also entering into the unhoused. We're dealing with immigrants, the LGBTQ plus community, and the list goes on of how racial justice magnifies itself in various ways within our communities. It's not some single track. We're going to tackle racial justice. There are so many facets of that stretch into other dimensions within our life and community with one another. So that's one example of something we've done, we've done it out of emotion, but we haven't responded purely with emotion. We've used emotion channeled in a way that allows us to be helpful partners in the community in which we serve. Second example, a year and a half ago, there was a video that became knowledgeable by someone in the church about learning about indigenous injustice. And there was a group out of New York that was leading this indigenous study of the atrocities of stealing of land, the treatment of original indigenous people in this continent. And so several people in the church signed up for this Zoom experience, which is about 4 to 5 hours long. I thought, just an hour Zoom call is long. 4 or 5 hours seems like a long time to be on the call. But they structured it, the leadership structured this experience over 5 hours virtually in a really meaningful way. They would show kind of a cycle of videos, some teaching. They'd have some interactive conversations. And then they would have someone play a native flute as part of almost like a worshipful experience. You had this education, dialogue, and worship rhythm that happened over that period. And I will tell you, that 5 hours flew by. It was a powerful education of how we have mistreated people that were original to this land over and over and over again in this country. Out of that video, there were several that watched that video, kind of had the question, well, now what? We've seen this video. It's great to have information. We should be doing something with this information. So there was a group of about 8 to 10 people, and they named themselves the Indigenous Discussion Group. And they met for at least a year before any action took place. And they're still meeting today. It's a group in the church that still meets today. After about a year of conversation, one of the ideas that came up out of that group was the idea of doing a land acknowledgement for St. Andrew Christian Church. To try to do as much research as we can, and we call it an open land acknowledgement, knowing that there's still more to learn about indigenous people that may have been on this land or have been here in the past, but we did what we could in the moment of learning everything we could. And Leadership Circle, which is our kind of decision-making body, affirmed that statement in March. And in May, we had an outside worship service to celebrate that land acknowledgement. One, it was celebrating what we learned, but the other part of that land acknowledgement, if you go out into the breezeway, you'll see a framed copy of it. Down at the bottom is one of the things we learned. At the bottom is promises. And we made 2 promises as a congregation. One, that we would lean into indigenous wisdom of people that are here now that live near and around this area. They've cared for this land way longer than we've ever been here. There's so much to learn from them as developing partnerships with indigenous people. And the second promise is within those partnerships, how do we be better caretakers and stewards of the land in which we're caring for? Now, since then, since May, we had a newly formed task group called the Landscape Task Force. It sounds very exciting. I'm sure it sounds very exciting. And so when this church started early, there was Building and Grounds Committee and there was the Sage Ministry. And since then, there's now about 7 or 8 different groups that are doing something in caring for our land. And so now all those groups are now going to meet quarterly, talking about how do we steward this land, how do we lean on the wisdom of those that have gone before us, and how do we best do that in stewardship of what's been entrusted to us. So that's a second example of we need to act, but we also need to be educated and informed about the things that we do when we act and have a sense of, do we just bear fruit, or are we bearing fruit that lasts for the long haul? The third example I want to share is, it was about 2 months ago, we learned that Week of Compassion, which is the relief arm of our denomination, when there is a hurricane or a disaster or something happens, money is sent to those places to give immediate relief to those traumatic situations. Week of Compassion also has a branch of its identity in support of immigrants and refugees. And about 2 months ago, they came out with a grant initiative to allow churches to apply for grants to support immigrants in their community. And the max grant that a congregation could get was $2,000. And I'm thinking, if St. Andrew's going to help immigrants in our community in the metro area, $2,000 isn't going to get very far. And so I met with our Hand of Welcome ministry, which is our immigrant refugee ministry in the church. And Janie Pryor and Allie Batty and I met and had a conversation. And we started dreaming a little bit of, could this look differently than just us applying for $2,000? And the birth and the growth and the development out of that conversation was really fantastic. We began to think, well, we don't have all the answers for what immigrants may need, though we're in a timely way where immigrants have lots of needs in our community right now. But some of the organizations that with their boots on the ground doing that work know what the needs are. They know what needs are missing. And so the three of us brainstormed other congregations that might be open to this work, and brainstormed all the organizations that we had some tie or partnership with related to immigrant support. And in that 2-week period, we actually have a Zoom call this coming week, and we have 9 congregations that are going to join that Zoom call. And we have 9 organizations in the metro area that specifically work with immigrants are going to be a part of that conversation. And out of those 18 entities, we are just going to listen to one another and see if there is some common thread of ways that we can support immigrants, either organizations that don't have resources for this, or they would love to do this but don't have money for that. And so with each congregation applying, we've gotten permission for Week of Compassion that all those congregations involved can all apply for that grant and get $2,000. And so we can get almost $20,000 just in congregations participating in this. And if congregations want to do additional fundraisers for that, we could do even greater than that. But I'm just so excited about what we can do for immigrants versus let's listen and let a newer, more sustainable answer rise up out of the conversation, out of the discernment, out of the discussion to something we can do more holistically to support a population in our metro area that is fearful and scared, not wanting to go get resources because they're afraid they'll be picked up by ICE. There's all kinds of fears. Is there something we can do collectively with more congregations and more organizations to make a wider impact to our immigrants? So that's a third example of what I would call bearing fruit that lasts. I learned long ago that when we make decisions, it's easy just to make a decision and go with it. I was taught early on that there are 2 decisions. Before you make any decision, you have to answer 2 questions. The first is, how will this decision impact me? If it's not going to hurt me or harm me anyway, I can go forward with that decision. And I would call that the first little circle. And that's a very insulated, selfish way to make decisions. If we stepped out to the next concentric circle outside of just me, would be my family circle. And I can make a decision for me all day long, but when I make a decision, it's going to impact Jennifer's life, and Walker's life, and Sarah's life, and my father-in-law, and my mother's, and my brother's. And when I make a decision, it impacts my family system. So I don't just make an isolated decision in the inner circle and think it's going to be fine, not knowing the impacts it has on the next circle of influence, which is my family. When I step back a little further, and then the next circle is my church family and community. When I make some decision, it's going to impact my church community in some way and all the intricacies of relationships and webs of connection. I step back a little further, I'm in Johnson County in the metro area, and I step back a little further, and I'm in the United States, and I step back further, I'm in the world, and realizing that, does my little decision in here have an impact on the world? Well, it possibly can. And it can when I approach my life and knowing that all the relationships I have is not some people are over here and some people are over here and some people are less important here, more important here. I'm kind of going back to that passage where Jesus says, I want you no longer to look at people in terms of categories, who's less or more important. I want you to look at people simply as friends. And every time we make a decision about something, we are making decisions about equitable change in the people around us. This work of acting, and it sounds simple. If there's a problem, my inclination is I want to go fix that problem. I want to solve it. But if I step back and use what Abbott and Blythe talked about in their book, Incline Your Ear, the first step before you do anything is, how is God working in the world around me and in the people I love and care about? First is kind of an awareness of God in the midst. The second is context. Who am I? Who are others? How are we in relationship with one another? How are we not in relationship with one another? How does my context impact other people's context? The third is discernment, brainstorming, looking at all the possibilities. And then finally, this last stage, which we talk about today, is acting. Acting out of an informed, passionate, emotion-driven response that blends in all these opportunities to do far greater work than if I'd have just gone in, well, let me tell you, this is how you solve this. More times than not, any decision I want to make for myself in the inner circle might feel good that I made some decision. But if I opened up the possibilities to the circles beyond myself, the result that comes out of the action that comes out of that is always far more significant and greater than I would have ever done by myself. We can look at the world and think, how in the world did we get where we are? Why do people treat people the way they do? Why is there such anger and hostility to this group of people? To this people with their skin color, with this group of people for how they love? How do we get that we treat one another this way? Why do we not listen to one another? Why does someone have to be right all the time? And I just go back to this John 15 passage. Starts out pretty simply. Love one another. And then the hard part is we have to no longer look at someone by the category or their political party or where they live or where they don't live. We have to see each other as friends. Change the nature of how we interact and engage one another. And then as friends, we have an opportunity to enact real change, not just make us feel good, but change that is beyond myself, beyond ourselves, a bearing fruit that lasts. I give thanks for people willing to listen, willing to realign their relationships so that the things we want to see, imagine, the dream that God has for the world can be possible through us and one another if we let friendship do its part. May we act with our minds, our hearts, our souls as we do this work together. Amen.